There is a short-term political headache now. There is clearly an itch that the president wants to scratch around cost of pharmaceuticals in the US. It's a tool which allows direct use or enforcement of executive power.
If your production costs are becoming more as a result of that, you're less competitive. It's very unpredictable, whether it's geopolitical reasons, political reasons, or economic reasons.
Companies are having to get to grips with a world which is driven much more by short-term political impulses than we were used to.
It's now August, and guess what? We're still talking about tariffs. We've just ended the period of pause where countries had the opportunity to cut a deal with the United States, and we have seen deals. We've seen it from the EU, we've seen it from the UK, Japan, and others. But one notable exception, Matt, of course, has been Switzerland, and we've just heard that 39% tariff rate is going to be applied to Swiss imports into the United States. What do you make of that? Is this truly disastrous?
Well, I think it's certainly uncomfortable. We saw the Swiss president and economy minister doing a last-minute dash to Washington to try and turn things around.
It didn't work.
It didn't work. They didn't even get into the White House, and yeah, I think it's going to be very worrying for them. There will be a lot of head-scratching in Bern about what happens next. I think we can guarantee the Federal Council won't want to leave the tariff rate at 39%, so they'll be looking at all angles they can play to go back in and reduce that further. But there is a short-term political headache now. How do you manage the impact?
I hope we've not seen the end of this, because let's put this in context. This is really meaningful for Switzerland. The US represents something like 13% of Swiss exports. It represents about 6% of Swiss GDP, so it's not insignificant. What I think is interesting within the mix, however, it's dominated by pharmaceuticals. About 50% of exports to the US are pharmaceuticals. What's interesting, and was new to me in a way, was 15% of exports to the United States are gold exports. And the reason I single those two out is so far they are not part of this 39%. Of course, were they to become part of that, that would have that significant impact. But if you strip them out, of course, it's round about 2% of Swiss GDP that's impacted as we stand today. But we're told by the US administration that pharmaceuticals are next in line. Is this all a bargaining tool around what happens with the pharmaceutical industry more broadly, do you think?
That would be my assumption. I mean, I've not got insight into what was on the table between the Swiss government and the US negotiators, but looking at where things have landed, and with that huge piece still pending around pharmaceuticals, which is key export from Switzerland to the US, there is clearly an itch that the president wants to scratch around cost of pharmaceuticals in the US. They're looking for levers, pressure that they can put on pharmaceutical firms outside of the States. And so I think one would assume that there's an expectation that when those tariffs, those sectoral tariffs become clear, we'll start to get a better sense as to what the end game might actually look like.
Now, President Trump, he was very specific about Switzerland. He focused on the $40 billion deficit. And that was an argument for the tough tariff positions. We're seeing different approaches to tariffs in different parts of the world. In the case of Switzerland, it was very much focused on the deficit. Whereas in the case of Brazil, we're seeing a more political element to tariffs, 50% there. And of course, with India, potentially 50% there regarding its relationships with Russia. Are we just moved away, or were we never really about economics as far as tariffs were concerned? Was this just a tool to influence policy, geopolitical policy?
I think so. I think it's a tool which allows direct use or enforcement of executive power. And if you're in the Oval Office, tariffs are the tool that you can use most easily, or certainly if you're using the IEEPA justification for tariffs, which have been the basis for these reciprocal tariffs. And I think we're going to see more of that. I think also what we need to be conscious of is that, you know, there's the headlines around these tariff rates, but underneath that there are it's a Swiss cheese approach. There are plenty of exemptions, and that reflects the fact that, you know, US companies have a strong interest in keeping a lid on the input costs and making sure that they're not having their whole business strategies blown off course. And they will be, I'm sure, lobbying very hard behind the scenes to make sure that those exemptions remain, that the impacts are not going to end up really derailing the US economy. But look, it's a story that's not ended yet.
No, and I think that's a very important point, because of course the other issues around semiconductors, and there's a potential now to have 100% tariffs on semiconductor imports into the United States. But I think your point is a good one, and something I feel quite strongly about. It's how these affect the US or corporate America more broadly. And of course, if your input costs are increasing quite dramatically, even if you're producing in America, which is what President Trump wants to happen, if your production costs are becoming more as a result of that, you're less competitive. So I think there will be a lot of toing and froing. I think there will be a lot of exemptions. We've seen that in terms of the way that copper is being thought about as well. So the good news, in a way, is that still market forces will have some impact in terms of what these tariffs will ultimately do. The bad news is it's very unpredictable, whether it's geopolitical reasons, political reasons, or economic reasons. As a company, it's a very difficult operating environment. So again, you think there's going to be more turmoil ahead. We're not through this yet.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think companies are having to get to grips with a world which is driven much more by short-term political impulses than we were used to. The sort of technocratic, more predictable, multilateral interfaces that shaped, the world from the 90s onwards, particularly in the trade space, that's gone.
Yeah.
And that makes things less predictable. There's higher volatility. That will come with risks, but it'll all come with opportunities as well.
Well, once again, Matt, we've been talking about the downside. There is some good news, which is that so far, at least, the global economy is managing to weather this. So far, the US has been in reasonably good shape. But there will have an impact. All of this uncertainty, it takes time to feed through the system. It generally means the growth dynamic will be lower. And specifically in the United States, we are continuing to suspect that the inflation impulse will be higher in the months ahead. We still think the Federal Reserve will be cutting rates because of that growth slowdown. But it is a difficult period, and it's certainly unpredictable, as we've alluded to. So Matt, let's pick that up in the weeks and the months ahead. We've also got the issues around potential ceasefires in Ukraine as well. So a lot to discuss. So we'll look forward to having these chats. Hopefully there'll be some better news to report. But to all our audience, remember to subscribe and like, and we will be speaking to you again, whether you like it or not, very soon.